He was a man hollowed by loss, who bought a girl broken by cruelty, until he discovered she held the key to mending them both, in a world that had tried to throw them away. The dust of Redemption Gulch swirled like angry spirits around the makeshift auction block, a cruel parody of commerce where desperation was the only currency. Elara stood there, a whisper of a girl, no more than 18 summers, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of 100 winters. Her dress, thin and torn, did little to ward off the chill wind that carried the scent of stale beer and fresh despair from the saloon nearby. Jedediah Thorne, owner of that saloon and, for now, owner of Elara, bellowed her supposed failings to the gathered crowd. Useless. Too sick to work, this one. Always coughing, always weak. But she's young enough. Someone give me a price for her indenture papers before I toss her to the coyotes. His words, laced with cheap whiskey and casual malice, struck Elara like physical blows, but she did not flinch, did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears only invited more pain. Her head was bowed, not in submission, but as if conserving the last embers of her spirit. The townsfolk, a grim collection of hard-bitten miners, weary homesteaders, and sharp-eyed opportunists, watched with a mixture of pity, scorn, and a chilling indifference. Some muttered about her persistent cough, the way she seemed to sway on her feet, the pallor of her skin. Damaged goods, one man spat, his gaze lingering on her with an owner's assessing cruelty. Another woman, her face a roadmap of prairie hardship, clutched her child's hand tighter, as if Elara's misfortune were a contagious disease. Redemption Gulch was a place that chewed up the vulnerable and spat out the bones. Elara was being offered up as just another scrap, a burden to be shifted, a life to be bartered for the price of a few drinks. She felt the weight of their judgment, a suffocating blanket woven from their fears and their hardness. Jedediah grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her frail flesh like talons. Look at her! Barely a mouthful for a strong man, but she can scrub floors, can't you, girl? He shook her, and a dry, racking cough tore from her chest, echoing in the sudden silence that fell upon the crowd. It was the sound of a life unraveling, thread by painful thread. She was beaten every day, sometimes for the cough, sometimes for her slowness, sometimes for reasons she could never fathom, always for being too sick to work, a label seared into her soul. Caleb Sheridan stood at the edge of the crowd, a shadow amongst shadows. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was unreadable, his eyes the color of a winter sky. A slight limp, a memento from a war he'd rather forget, marked his gait. He was a man of few words, his solitude a fortress built brick by lonely brick on his isolated ranch miles from this den of casual cruelty. He'd come to town for salt and nails, not to witness a soul being sold like chattel. The sight of Elara, small and defiant in her misery, stirred something in the dormant chambers of his heart, a place where grief for his lost Martha and their babe lay like a permanent frost. He'd sworn off attachments, off the vulnerability that came with caring. Another sick woman, another fragile life, his mind screamed a warning. He'd buried too much hope already. Yet, Jedediah's grating voice, Elara's silent endurance, the collective apathy of the crowd, it was a litany of wrongs that scraped against his deeply ingrained sense of honor. He saw not the sick girl the town proclaimed, but a flicker of untamed spirit in the depths of her downcast eyes, a resilience that shamed them all. His internal conflict was a silent, bitter battle. To walk away was easy, logical. To intervene was to invite pain, complications, memories. Then Jedediah shoved Elara forward again, and she stumbled, catching herself with a desperate, shaky grace. That was when Caleb moved. He pushed through the onlookers, his quiet passage parting them like a ship's prow through reluctant water. He stopped before Thorne, his presence, though unassuming, carrying an undeniable weight. How much? Caleb's voice was raspy from disuse, low but clear, cutting through Jedediah's bluster. Thorne, surprised, sized him up. Well, Caleb Sheridan. Didn't figure you for this kind of sport. For you, considering her state, $20 a murmur went through the crowd. A steep price for damaged goods. Caleb didn't haggle. He reached into his worn leather pouch, the one that held the money he'd been saving for a new breeding bull, the key to his ranch's meager future. He counted out the coins, each one a sacrifice, a piece of his hard-won solitude being traded away. He placed the silver in Thorne's greedy palm. Then, before anyone could speak, before Thorne could gloat or Elara could fully comprehend, Caleb stated, his voice devoid of emotion but firm as bedrock, "She's my wife." A collective gasp. Jedediah's jaw dropped. Caleb met his gaze. The papers. Thorne, momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer audacity and the unexpected claim of marriage, fumbled for the indenture documents. He handed them over, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and thwarted greed. Caleb took them, glanced at the cruel script, then tucked them into his coat. He turned to Elara, his expression still unreadable. He offered not a hand, but a slight inclination of his head towards the street. "Come." And with that, he turned and walked away, expecting her to follow, leaving behind a silenced, bewildered crowd and a sputtering Jedediah Thorne. Elara, frozen for a heartbeat, looked from Caleb's retreating back to the faces around her, then, with a deep, shuddering breath that was half sob, half hope, she followed the silent man who had just bought her freedom with a lie and all he had. Caleb's ranch was a testament to his solitude, nestled in a small, arid valley miles from any neighbor, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the sparse pines and the distant cry of a hawk. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs, Spartan in its furnishings, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot in one corner. Another, even smaller room, was Caleb's. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the single window. To Elara, stepping over the threshold, it felt less like a haven and more like another cage, albeit a quieter one. Fear was a familiar companion, and it clung to her now, whispering warnings. She expected demands, blows, the familiar litany of her inadequacies. But Caleb merely gestured towards the cot. "That's yours." He then moved to the fireplace, laying a fire with an economy of motion that spoke of long habit. He didn't look at her, didn't speak further. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elara remained standing, clutching her hands, unsure of what to do, what was expected. In her past life, idleness was a sin punished swiftly. She scanned the small cabin, her eye searching for work. A pile of mending, floors to scrub, anything to prove her worth, to stave off the anger she was sure lurked beneath his stoic surface. Caleb finally spoke, his voice still gruff. "There's water in the bucket. Food in the sack yonder. Eat when you're hungry." He didn't watch her. He busied himself with tasks outside, mending a harness, checking on his few scrawny chickens. Elara, after an agonizing period of hesitation, ladled some water into a tin cup, her hand shaking so much she spilled some. She ate a piece of dry bread, forcing it down a throat tight with apprehension. Days bled into a quiet routine. Caleb rose before dawn, worked his harsh land until dusk, speaking only when necessary, his sentences clipped and functional. Elara, desperate to earn her keep, swept the already clean floor, tidied the meager belongings, patched one of Caleb's threadbare shirts with tiny, meticulous stitches. She was always cold, always tired, the cough still a persistent shadow, but she worked until her body ached, terrified of being found wanting. Caleb observed her silent, frantic efforts, his expression unchanging. But one evening, he returned to find her huddled by the fire, shivering despite its warmth. The next morning, an old, mended but clean wool blanket lay folded on her cot. He said nothing. When a loose shutter banged incessantly in the wind, keeping her awake, she found it repaired the next day. He noticed her worn-out shoes, thin soles offering little protection against the rocky ground. A week later, a pair of sturdy, used boots, small enough for her, appeared by her cot. They were old, but they were whole. He never acknowledged these small acts, these quiet provisions. He simply did them. Slowly, infinitesimally, a sliver of Elara's fear began to recede, replaced by a profound confusion. This kindness, unspoken and undemanding, was a language she didn't understand, yet it touched a part of her she thought had long since died. She still worked tirelessly, but the frantic edge to her movements began to soften. She watched him, his quiet strength, the way his calloused hands were gentle with his animals, the sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The silence in the cabin remained, but it was no longer solely the silence of fear, it was becoming the silence of observation, of tentative curiosity. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The harsh autumn landscape around the ranch softened under a blanket of early snow, and the world outside their small valley seemed to retreat even further. Inside the cabin, a fragile truce had settled. Ilara's cough, though still present, was less severe. The relentless terror that had been her constant companion was slowly being replaced by a watchful weariness, and sometimes, a fleeting sense of peace. The evenings were the quietest, the fire crackling in the hearth the only sound, casting dancing shadows on the rough log walls. Caleb would sit in his chair, mending tack or sharpening a tool, while Ilara sat on her cot, often with a piece of mending of her own. One such night, the wind howled outside like a mournful beast. Caleb stared into the flames, his usual stoic mask softened by the firelight, revealing the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. He spoke, his voice low, as if talking to himself as much as to her. "The war, it changes a man. Takes things you can't get back." He paused, the silence stretching, before he continued, the words coming slow and hard-won. "Lost my folks to the fever when I was a boy. Then Martha, my wife." His voice cracked slightly on her name. "And our little Thomas. Another fever. Nothing I could do." He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Ilara listened, her heart aching for this quiet, wounded man. His grief was a raw, palpable thing, a mirror to her own hidden pain. Emboldened by his vulnerability, by the shared space of sorrow, she found her own voice, hesitant at first, like a bird testing its wings after a storm. I don't remember my parents," she began, her words barely a whisper. "I was at the orphanage in St. Louis. Then, sold. First to a farmer. His wife was cruel. Then a blacksmith." He drank. She traced a pattern on the rough blanket with a trembling finger. "Always told I was sickly, a burden. Jedediah, he was the worst." The story tumbled out, fragments of abuse, of hunger, of constant fear, of being an unwanted thing passed from one uncaring hand to another. She spoke of the beatings, not with self-pity, but with a strange detachment, as if narrating someone else's life. The sickness she carried, she explained, was less a true ailment of the lungs and more a crushing weariness of spirit, a body protesting years of neglect and brutality. She had never told anyone so much. The telling was a release, a small, painful lancing of a festering wound. Caleb listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the fire, but she felt his attention, his silent empathy. When she finally fell silent, tears she hadn't realized she was shedding tracing cold paths down her cheeks, he didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. The shared confessions didn't magically erase their pasts, but they forged a new, deeper connection in the quiet cabin, a bond woven from shared pain and a nascent, unspoken trust. They were two solitary souls, shipwrecked by life, who had found a momentary, fragile anchorage in each other's presence. The silence that followed was different, no longer heavy with unspoken fears, but filled with the quiet resonance of shared humanity. The fragile peace of their shared solitude was shattered by the fury of an early, unexpected blizzard. The wind shrieked like a banshee, hurling snow against the small cabin with relentless force, piling drifts against the door and window. Caleb had been out checking his meager trap lines, a necessary task to supplement their dwindling winter supplies, hoping to beat the storm he'd seen gathering in the bruised-looking sky. But the weather had turned with brutal speed. Hours passed, and Ilara, watching the snow obliterate the landscape, felt a cold dread creep into her heart, a fear that had nothing to do with her own safety. Caleb was still out there. As dusk bled into a terrifying, howling darkness, she knew she couldn't wait. Donning Caleb's oversized spare coat and wrapping a shawl around her head, she forced the cabin door open against the wind and stepped into the maelstrom. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. Snow stung her face, blinding her. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat to the relative safety of the cabin, but the image of Caleb, alone and injured in the storm, pushed her forward. She fought her way towards the area where he'd said his traps were laid, her calls of his name swallowed by the wind almost before they left her lips. It was near an outcrop of rocks, a place he'd said offered some shelter, that she found him. He was semi-conscious, slumped against a boulder, his injured leg twisted at an unnatural angle, a dusting of snow already covering him like a premature shroud. His old war wound had given out in the struggle against the elements. Fever was beginning to burn in his eyes. Panic seized Elara, cold and sharp, but then a different instinct took over, a fierce, protective urge she hadn't known she possessed. He was a large man, and she, small and still not fully recovered from her own years of neglect. But desperation lent her an almost preternatural strength. She managed to get him to his feet, his arm heavy across her shoulders, and half-dragged, half-carried him through the blinding snow, step by agonizing step, back towards the faint, beckoning glow of the cabin light she'd left burning in the window. The journey was an eternity of biting wind, burning lungs, and numb limbs. Once inside, she collapsed, breathless, but only for a moment. Caleb was shivering violently, his teeth chattering, his skin hot to the touch. The doctor was a day's ride away, impossible in this storm. She was on her own. And then, from some forgotten corner of her memory, knowledge surfaced. An old woman, kind for a brief season in her childhood, had taught her about herbs, about the healing properties of plants. It was a skill she'd never had cause to use, buried deep beneath layers of trauma. Now, it bloomed. She packed snow around his injured leg to keep the swelling down, her touch surprisingly gentle yet firm. She rummaged through Caleb's meager supplies, finding dried willow bark for fever, yarrow for cleansing. She brewed teas, forcing the warm liquid past his chapped lips. She kept the fire roaring, melting snow for water, tending to him through the long, terrifying night and into the next day as the storm continued to rage. Her cough was forgotten, her own fatigue ignored. She moved with a focused intensity, her slight frame imbued with an iron will. She was no longer the sick girl, the burden. She was a healer, a protector, fighting for the life of the man who had shown her the first true kindness she had ever known. The blizzard raged for 3 days, isolating the small ranch completely. Inside the cabin, Elara was a tireless sentinel. Caleb's fever had been high, his consciousness wavering, but slowly, under her relentless care, it began to recede. The poultices she fashioned from hoarded scraps of cloth and crushed herbs seemed to draw the fire from his injured leg. She spooned broth into his mouth, bathed his brow, and spoke to him in soft, soothing tones, words of encouragement and reassurance, though she wasn't sure he could hear. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world transformed, pristine and silent under a thick mantle of white, Caleb was weak but lucid. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear and steady. He saw not the frail, beaten girl he had taken from Redemption Gulch, but a woman of extraordinary strength and quiet capability. He tried to thank her, his voice a hoarse whisper, but she simply shook her head, a small, shy smile touching her lips. The shared ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of their formal distance. A new intimacy, born of mutual dependence and profound gratitude, settled between them. However, their newfound peace was fragile. Just as Caleb was beginning to regain some strength, a week later, 3 riders appeared on the horizon, dark figures against the snow-bright landscape. Elara's heart plummeted. She recognized the swagger of the lead rider instantly, Jedediah Thorne, flanked by 2 of his brutish cronies. They had come. Thorne's excuse would be concern, or perhaps a desire to reclaim what he still considered his property, now that she was no longer too sick to work, a fact he might have surmised if whispers of Caleb's injury and subsequent recovery had reached town. Caleb, still largely confined to his chair by the fire but his eyes clear and hard, watched their approach through the small window. "Stay inside, Elara," he said, his voice low and firm. He reached for the old rifle that leaned in the corner, a weapon he hadn't touched in years, its presence a grim reminder of a past he'd tried to bury. His reluctance to resort to violence was a palpable thing, the war had scarred him in ways deeper than just his leg. But the sight of Thorne, leering as he dismounted and strode towards the cabin, hardened his resolve. Thorne banged on the door. "Sheridan. I heard you were laid up. Came to see if you needed help." And to discuss the girl, Caleb opened the door, standing framed in the doorway, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in his hands. "We need no help from you, Thorne. And there's nothing to discuss." She's my wife. Thorne's eyes narrowed, taking in Caleb's still weakened state, then flickered past him, trying to catch a glimpse of Ilara. Wife? That was a convenient story, Sheridan. But her indenture papers are clear. You bought her services, not her soul. And I hear she's made a remarkable recovery. Too good for a backwoods rancher like you now, eh? Maybe she's worth more than I thought. His words were a clear threat, an intention to extort or reclaim. The confrontation he had dreaded was upon him. Caleb knew this was not just about Ilara, it was about Thorne's wounded pride, his greed, and his sadistic pleasure in tormenting those he perceived as weaker. Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle, the cold metal a stark contrast to the simmering anger within him. He was a man who craved peace, who had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, but looking at Thorne's sneering face, at the predatory gleam in his eyes as they tried to pierce the cabin's gloom for a sight of Ilara, something snapped. This wasn't the battlefield, where enemies were faceless. This was his home, and Ilara, the woman who had nursed him back from the brink, was inside. She's not for sale, Thorne, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. And she's not going anywhere. You best turn around and ride out. Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the stillness of the snow-covered valley. Getting mighty protective, Sheridan. What's she to you really? Some kind of miracle worker? Fixed that gimpy leg of yours, did she? He took a step closer, his cronies fanning out slightly behind him, their hands near their holstered pistols. I think I'll just take what's mine. As Thorne lunged for the doorway, Caleb moved, not with the practiced efficiency of a soldier, but with the desperate agility of a cornered animal protecting its own. He didn't fire the rifle, instead, he used it as a barrier, shoving the barrel hard into Thorne's chest, sending him staggering back. One of Thorne's men reached for his gun, but before he could draw, Ilara was there. She had emerged from the shadows of the cabin, no longer a timid, frightened girl. In her hand, she wielded the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her eyes blazing with a courage that stunned them all. Leave him alone, she cried, her voice clear and strong, echoing Caleb's earlier protectiveness. The sight of Ilara, so fierce and resolute, momentarily distracted Thorne's men. Caleb seized the advantage. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the wrist of the man reaching for his gun, a sharp crack and a howl of pain following. The other crony hesitated, suddenly less confident. Thorne, enraged, charged again, roaring like a wounded bull. Caleb met him head-on. They grappled, a desperate, clumsy fight fueled by righteous fury on one side and brutish greed on the other. Caleb, still not at his full strength, fought with a primal determination he hadn't felt since the war, but this time it wasn't for a flag or a cause, it was for her, for the fragile sanctuary they had begun to build. Ilara, seeing Caleb struggle, darted forward and swung the poker with all her might, connecting with Thorne's shoulder. He bellowed in pain and surprise, loosening his grip on Caleb. Caleb pushed him away, sending him sprawling into the snow. Thorne's men, seeing their leader down and one of their own nursing a broken wrist, lost their stomach for the fight. They dragged Thorne to his feet, who, clutching his shoulder and spewing curses, finally understood he was beaten. They mounted their horses and retreated, a trio of humiliated figures disappearing back the way they came, leaving only trampled snow and the lingering scent of fear in their wake. In the sudden, ringing silence, Caleb leaned heavily against the doorframe, breathing hard, the rifle still in his hand. Ilara rushed to his side, her earlier fierceness replaced by anxious concern. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, looking at her, truly seeing her strength, her fire. He reached out, not for the poker, but for her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. He pulled a small object from his pocket, a little wooden meadowlark, intricately carved, its surface worn smooth with time. He had made it years ago, in a brighter time, for Martha. He pressed it into Ilara's palm. "This ain't keeping, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is too sin. I choose you." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief, of a belonging she had never dared to dream of. She closed her fingers around the small bird, a symbol of hope, a promise of a new song. Spring arrived at Meadowlark Rise, for that is what Caleb and Ilara decided to call their ranch, a name that whispered of new beginnings and the sweet song of the bird she now kept carefully wrapped in a piece of soft linen. The snows melted, feeding the parched earth, and where once there had been only dust and struggle, tiny green shoots unfurled. Ilara, with an intuitive grace Caleb marveled at, found a small, forgotten packet of seeds in a tin box that had belonged to Martha, wildflower seeds. She planted them around the cabin, tending them with the same gentle care she had shown Caleb. Soon, bursts of improbable color, blues, yellows, and reds, bloomed against the weathered wood of the cabin and the harsh backdrop of the valley, a vibrant testament to life's tenacity. Ilara herself had blossomed. The persistent cough that had defined her in Redemption Gulch was a distant memory, replaced by the healthy bloom on her cheeks and the light in her eyes. Her quiet nature remained, but it was no longer born of fear, it was a serene stillness, a deep well of inner strength. She moved with a newfound confidence, her hands, once raw and trembling, now skilled in tending their small garden, mending their clothes, and preparing meals that, though simple, filled the cabin with the aroma of home. Caleb watched her, his heart, once a barren landscape of grief, now stirring with a love he thought had died with Martha. It was a different love, quieter, perhaps, forged in shared hardship and mutual healing, but no less profound. He still limped, the war and the blizzard leaving their indelible marks, but the haunted look in his eyes had softened, replaced by a gentle warmth whenever he looked at Ilara. He spoke more now, sharing stories of his youth, his dreams for the ranch, and she, in turn, would share her quiet observations about the changing seasons, the habits of the wild creatures that sometimes ventured near their cabin, her voice gaining a melodious confidence. They were a family, forged not by blood or societal decree, but by choice, by shared resilience, and by a love that had taken root in the stoniest of soils. The community of Redemption Gulch, once so quick to judge and condemn, heard whispers of the changes at the distant ranch. Tales of Ilara's courage against Thorne, of her healing touch that had supposedly saved Caleb from death's door, filtered back to the town. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. The women who had once clutched their children tighter in her presence now spoke of her with a grudging respect. When young Timmy Evans, son of the blacksmith, took a fever that the town's part-time sawbones couldn't break, his desperate mother, remembering the stories, made the arduous journey to Meadowlark Rise. Ilara, without hesitation, welcomed her, brewed her willow bark tea, and showed her how to make cooling compresses. Young Timmy recovered. After that, the trickle of respect became a small stream. They no longer called her the sick girl or even Caleb's wife with a sneer. Some called her Ilara the healer, others, the Meadowlark woman, for the small carved bird she sometimes wore on a leather thong around her neck, a gift, they knew, from Caleb. They still lived apart from the town, valuing their hard-won peace, but they were no longer outcasts. They had carved out their own sanctuary, a place where wildflowers bloomed defiance and two broken souls had found a way to become whole, together. Their life at Meadowlark Rise settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the quiet cadence of their shared existence. Caleb taught Ilara to read from an old, battered Bible and a tattered book of poems Martha had cherished. In turn, Ilara taught Caleb the names of the wild herbs that carpeted the valley floor in spring, explaining their uses with a knowledge that seemed as ancient as the hills themselves. She had a way with animals. The skittish deer would sometimes pause at the edge of the clearing, watching her with curious, unafraid eyes, and even Caleb's old hound, usually wary of strangers, had taken to sleeping at the foot of her cot from the earliest days. The ranch, once a place of stark survival, began to show signs of gentle prosperity. Caleb, with Ilara's help, cleared more land, planted a larger vegetable garden, and even managed to acquire a few more chickens and a milk cow. The cabin itself, once bare and echoing with unspoken sorrows, now felt like a true home. Ilara had hung dried herbs from the rafters, their faint, pleasant scent mingling with the smell of wood smoke and baking bread. She'd sewn curtains for the window from faded flour sacks, and a colorful rag rug lay before the hearth, a small island of warmth and cheer. The physical transformation of the ranch was merely an outward reflection of the deeper healing that had occurred within its occupants. Caleb's laughter, once a forgotten sound, could sometimes be heard, a low rumble that warmed Ilara to her core. He still carried his grief for Martha and Thomas, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it had become a gentle ache, a reminder of love once known that now made space for new affection. He found joy in simple things: the sight of Elara tending her flowers, the taste of her freshly baked bread, the quiet companionship of their evenings by the fire. Elara, too, had shed the last remnants of her haunted past. The fear that had been etched into her very bones had given way to a quiet confidence. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. She met Caleb's gaze directly, her eyes shining with an open, trusting affection. She had found her voice, not just to speak, but to sing softly as she worked, melodies learned in a forgotten childhood or perhaps composed by her own resilient spirit. The people of Redemption Gulch kept their distance for the most part, but their perception had undeniably shifted. When the cooper's wife suffered a difficult childbirth, it was Elara they sent for, remembering her steady hands and calming presence. She went, not as a miracle worker, but as a woman who understood pain and knew the solace of gentle care. She asked for nothing in return, but a few days later, a sturdy new bucket and a sack of precious sugar appeared on their doorstep. It was the town's way of saying thank you, their way of acknowledging the good that had taken root in the once barren soil of Meadowlark Rise, tended by two souls the world had once so readily dismissed. They had not just survived, they had cultivated a life rich in quiet dignity and profound, unwavering love, a testament to the enduring power of compassion in a harsh and unforgiving land. In a world that so often seeks to label and discard, Caleb Sheridan, a man scarred by his own deep losses, looked past the cruel pronouncements of a judgmental society and saw not a sick girl or damaged goods, but a human soul worthy of dignity and a chance at life. He saw Elara. An Elara who had been beaten down, abused, and told she was worthless, who carried the weight of a sickness born more of despair than disease, found in his quiet protection the space to not only heal but to reveal the extraordinary strength and gentle wisdom that lay within her. She, who was deemed broken, became the healer, mending not only Caleb's weary spirit but also the fractured pieces of her own. Their story is a quiet anthem to the profound truth that sanctuary is not always a place, but a presence, the unwavering compassion of another heart. It reminds us that true strength is often found not in loud declarations or grand gestures, but in the steadfast courage to choose kindness in the face of cruelty, to see value where others see none. It whispers that even the deepest wounds, the most ingrained sorrows, can begin to mend when met with understanding, patience, and the brave, tender act of choosing to love. They didn't just find each other, they helped each other find themselves, transforming a desolate patch of earth into a haven, and a life of mere survival into one of shared joy. If their journey from public despair to private salvation, their path to finding solace and building a home in a world that had all but cast them out, has touched your heart and resonated with your own search for light in dark places, please consider sharing their story. Let the quiet courage of Caleb and Elara inspire others. Like this narrative if it moved you, subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. And we invite you to share in the comments below, what does true sanctuary mean to you, and where have you found it in your own life? Your reflections are a part of this continuing story of connection and healing.